morning, everyone. It's an honor to be speaking with you all today. I'd like to take a moment to thank SAGES for this wonderful opportunity and the surgery department at the University of Vermont. Today I'm going to be talking about my research looking at intraoperative cholangiography and its impact on complication rates and operative time. I have nothing to disclose. So some backgrounds. The cholecystectomy is the most commonly performed procedure in the United States. The laparoscopic approach was first introduced in the United States by Doctors McKernan and Say in 1988, and since its introduction, the prevalence of the laparoscopic approach has taken off from there. And while outcomes and recovery times have been better with the laparoscopic approach, complications still persist, specifically bile leaks, bile duct injuries, and retained stones. So Mirzi was the first to report on the routine use of the intraoperative cholangiogram in the 1930s, and he advocated for its use to prevent bile leak and bile duct injuries. Since its introduction, however, the utility of the intraoperative cholangiogram has remained controversial. So here's a sampling of some of the controversy in the literature. The first study looked at Medicare patients in the US, and they found a reduction in common bile duct injuries when IOC was used. Another study looking at Texas Medicare patients found a similar reduction in complication rates when using IOC, but this effect disappeared when they controlled for confounders. Other studies have been able to find sufficient evidence to support or refute the use of IOC. And finally, SAGES published guidelines in 2016 advocating for frequent use of IOC. However, they stated that more evidence is needed before routine IOC can be recommended. So with this study, I aimed to investigate the relationship between IOC and complication rates. I also wanted to compare the complication rates in routine IOCs and selective IOCs. And I also wanted to look at the time that performing an IOC added to the procedure. This was a retrospective single-center study performed at the University of Vermont Medical Center. We included all patients above the age of 18 undergoing a cholecystectomy between the years of 2009 to 2016. Our total cohort was 2,764 patients. Primary outcomes were complication rates in patients with and without an IOC, and complication rates in patients with a selective versus routine IOC, and secondary outcome was time. Just quickly, any statistical analysis was completing using Stata version 15. We started with univariate analysis for complications and used logistic regression to control for confounders, and for time we used a student's t-test. So here's some of the demographic data. I just want to quickly point out about 35.1% of our cohort was operated on by a surgeon that performs IOC routinely, and 79.2% of these patients actually received an IOC. And 64.9% of our patients were operated on by a surgeon that performs IOC selectively, and 11% of these patients actually received an IOC. So here's the results concerning complication rates. The first table is looking at patients that received an IOC versus not an IOC. And there is a slight reduction in complication rates when an IOC was performed. The second table compares routine versus selective IOC patients, and there was a slight increase in complication rates in the selective IOC group. Additionally, performing an IOC added an average of 13.1 minutes to laparoscopic cases and 47.3 minutes to open cases. So as you may have noticed, the results concerning complication rates in IOC were not statistically significant, therefore definitive conclusions can't be drawn from this data. Just talking further on some of the patterns I pointed out. There was a slight decrease in complication rates in the IOC group. It was pretty small, but it could be impactful when applied to a larger population, especially considering the severity of some of these complications. Additionally, there was that increase in complication rates in the selective IOC group. It could mean that routine IOC is the safer approach. However, I think this is more likely due to a confounder. The selective IOC patients are more likely to suffer a complication if they had an IOC performed on them. The extra 13.1 minutes added to laparoscopic cases is pretty consistent with what's been found in the literature. And the 47.3 minutes was longer, but this makes sense in the context of a more complex case that might have needed to be converted to open. So with all this controversy in the literature, what about some of the alternatives to IOC? There are two main ones, the first being laparoscopic ultrasound. And while it has similar sensitivity and specificity to IOC when looking at common bile duct stones, its accuracy in looking at anatomy and detecting bile duct injuries hasn't been well studied. And the second being near-infrared fluorescent cholangiography. Its visualization is good, but it hasn't been shown to identify common bile duct stones. So while these new approaches may be promising, IOC still appears to be the gold standard. So the study wasn't without its limitations. First, it was performed at a single academic center, so that limits its generalizability to the overall US population. Secondly, its retrospective nature introduces some bias. Also, how we looked at time added to procedure, we looked at overall operating time. We didn't have data, specific start and end times for IOC available. And finally, this study was underpowered to find statistically significant results because these complications occur so rarely, a very large cohort would be required. So overall, there was a small but potentially impactful reduction in complication rates when performing IOC. There was that slight increase in complication rates in the selective IOC group, and performing an IOC added 13 minutes to laparoscopic case time and 47 minutes to open cases. I'd like to acknowledge all these individuals for all their help and guidance on this project. And thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.